I rested my forehead against the cool surface of our marble kitchen island, trying to block out the sound of Greg's voice. He was behind me, listing all the ways I'd failed at being a proper housewife again. The weekly ritual had become as predictable as his pressed shirts and punctual departures each morning. The laundry's piled up, dinner isn't ready, and look at this place. He gestured broadly, his wedding ring catching the afternoon light. What exactly do you do all day, Emma? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What did I do all day? I bit my tongue, swallowing the words that threatened to escape. I'd spent the morning finalizing acquisition paperwork for a tech startup that would revolutionize our product line, followed by 3 investor calls and a virtual meeting with our Tokyo team. But Greg didn't know that. To my husband of 5 years, I was simply failing at my wifely duties. I lost track of time, I said instead, the practiced excuse rolling off my tongue with practiced ease. I'll order something for dinner. Greg loosened his blue silk tie, the one I'd bought him last Christmas, with an exaggerated sigh of disappointment. My mother managed to raise 3 kids, keep an immaculate house, and have dinner on the table every night at 6. And she never lost track of time. Ah, yes, the sainted Patricia Harmon, whose domestic prowess was invoked in every one of these conversations. I'd met the woman exactly 4 times in our 5-year marriage, and each time she'd inspected my housekeeping with the thoroughness of a military commander reviewing troops. Your mother didn't work, I reminded him, immediately regretting taking the bait. Greg's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Work? Is that what you call those little crafting projects on your laptop? Honey, Pinterest blogs don't count as careers. If he only knew that my little crafting projects had built Horizon Technologies from a startup in my spare bedroom to a company now worth 8 figures. A company that, ironically, had just acquired the struggling software firm where my husband worked as a mid-level project manager. But that was my secret. The carefully guarded double life I'd maintained since we'd married. Greg believed I was a failed entrepreneur who occasionally sold handmade jewelry online, a convenient cover for my absences and the income that supplemented his salary. He had no idea that tomorrow everything would change. You're right, I conceded, the words ashen in my mouth. One more day of this charade. Just one more day. I'll try harder. Greg's expression softened slightly, the momentary anger fading into what he probably thought was loving concern. He crossed the kitchen and placed his hands on my shoulders, his touch proprietary. I just worry about you, Em. You need structure, purpose. His thumbs dug slightly into my muscles. Maybe if we had kids, you'd have something meaningful to focus on instead of wasting your potential. The suggestion hung between us, not for the first time. Children had been Greg's increasing preoccupation over the past year, though he'd shown little interest in the early years of our marriage. Now, approaching 40, he'd decided it was time to create his legacy. Never mind that my input on the matter seemed incidental. I managed a non-committal smile. Maybe. Satisfied with what he took as agreement, Greg released me and checked his watch, the luxury timepiece I'd given him for his last birthday, though he believed it had come from his parents. I'm going to shower and change. The Richardsons invited us for drinks, remember? Mark just closed that big account with Novatech. I did remember, because Novatech was one of my company's subsidiaries. The acquisition had been my decision, though. Mark Richardson, Greg's drinking buddy and colleague, would never know that the mysterious CEO who'd authorized the deal was standing in this kitchen, being lectured about laundry. I'll get ready, I promised, already mentally calculating which outfit would maintain my carefully crafted image as Greg's underachieving wife. As Greg disappeared upstairs, I pulled out my secure phone, the one he didn't know about, and checked the notifications. 23 messages from Sarah, my COO and closest confidant. The final pieces were falling into place for tomorrow. Sarah's latest text was simple. War room prepped. Legal standing by. Operation Lazy Housewife is go for Borough 900. I permitted myself a small smile. Sarah had never approved of my double life, or of Greg, but she'd respected my decisions. When I'd finally revealed my plan 3 months ago, she'd been the first to back me, bringing her signature efficiency to the carefully orchestrated corporate takedown we'd planned. The shower started upstairs, and I quickly texted back, "Confirmed, see you at 800 for final review." Then I tucked the phone away and began the transformation from Emma Chen, secret CEO, to Emma Harmon, decorative and slightly disappointing wife. The designer jeans were swapped for a floral dress that Patricia would approve of, subtle makeup applied, and hair arranged in soft waves, the look of a woman with plenty of time on her hands. By the time Greg came downstairs in fresh clothes, I was the picture of wifely readiness, all evidence of my other life hidden away. "You look nice," he said, his approval warming me despite everything. That was the complexity of it. Despite his condescension, despite the separate lives we'd been living, there had been love here once. Maybe there still was, buried beneath layers of resentment and secrets. "Thanks." I grabbed my purse, the affordable one, not the hand-stitched Italian leather briefcase I used at the office. "Ready to go?" The Richardsons lived in the same exclusive, gated community as we did, though their house was newer, bigger, more ostentatious. Mark had made sure of that, competitive as always with my husband. Little did he know the house Greg and I lived in had been paid for in cash, by me. "There they are," Mark boomed as we entered their oversized foyer. He clapped Greg on the shoulder, cocktail already in hand. "Man of the hour. Heard about the promotion. VP of operations moving up in the world?" I froze, my practiced smile almost slipping. Promotion? Greg hadn't mentioned any promotion. My husband had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "It's not official yet. Announcements tomorrow." Mark's wife Jennifer appeared, air-kissing my cheeks. "Emma, darling, you look lovely. That dress is so quaint." The slight pause conveyed everything about how she viewed my station in life. Jennifer worked part-time as a real estate agent. A career she never failed to mention gave her the perfect balance of professional fulfillment and family time. Her implication that I had failed at both was always thinly veiled. "Thank you," I replied simply, accepting the glass of white wine Mark handed me. "Congratulations on the Novatech deal." Mark puffed up visibly. "Biggest account of the quarter." The CEO of the parent company signed off personally, though nobody ever sees the elusive Ms. Chen. Works entirely remotely, apparently. Greg rolled his eyes. Another one of those modern executives who think they're too important for face-to-face meetings. I sipped my wine to hide my expression. If only he knew that Ms. Chen had been sleeping next to him for 5 years. "Heard some interesting rumors about Everglade, though," Mark continued, leading us to their expansive patio overlooking an unnecessarily large swimming pool. Everglade Software was Greg's employer, the company my firm had recently acquired through a series of shell corporations. "Word is there's a major reorganization coming. New ownership." Greg waved a dismissive hand. "Corporate shuffling. Happens every few years. Won't affect the executive team. If anything, it'll just give us more autonomy. That's why they're announcing my promotion tomorrow. Stability during the transition." The confidence in his voice was remarkable, considering tomorrow would bring the complete dismantling of everything he thought he knew about his company and his marriage. "Emma, honey," Jennifer interjected, clearly bored with business talk. "How's your little online shop doing? Still making those cute bracelets?" Her condescension was so familiar I barely noticed it anymore. "It keeps me busy." "Well, that's the important thing, having a hobby." She patted my arm. "Though I always say a woman's most important job is supporting her husband's career. That's why Mark and I are such a power couple." Greg laughed, sharing a look with Mark. "Emma's more of a free spirit. Structure isn't really her thing. Which is why we're so grateful Greg found someone like you." Jennifer continued, her smile not reaching her eyes. He needs a steady hand at home with all his responsibilities. I thought about my company's organizational chart, how tomorrow Greg would discover exactly where he stood in relation to me. The irony almost made me laugh. More wine? I offered instead, rising to refill glasses and escape the conversation. In the Richardsons' gleaming kitchen, I took a moment to breathe, checking my secure phone quickly. Another message from Sarah. Final personnel lists confirmed. HR briefed. Security protocols in place. I texted back, good. Any issues with the Richardson account? Mark's connection to Novatech would need careful handling in the reorganization. Sarah's reply was immediate. Flagged for review. Background check on Richardson complete. Multiple ethics violations noted. Interesting. I made a mental note to look at Mark's file personally. If he was cutting corners with Novatech, that would explain some discrepancies in recent reports. Everything okay? I startled, nearly dropping my phone as Greg appeared in the doorway. I slipped the device into my pocket with practiced ease. Just checking the time. It's getting late. He frowned slightly. It's barely 8 a.m. Besides, Mark wants to celebrate my promotion. The one you didn't tell me about, I countered, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Greg had the grace to look slightly abashed. I was going to surprise you. It comes with a significant raise, enough that you could focus on starting our family instead of your online shop. There it was again. The assumption that my life, my choices, would naturally bend to accommodate his plans. It had been this way since our first year of marriage, when I'd made the fateful decision to keep my growing company secret after hearing him mock a female CEO in his industry as probably sleeping her way to the top. We should talk about that. At home, I said quietly. Nothing to talk about, he countered, his tone gentle but firm. It's time, Emma. You're 36. We can't wait forever. The ease with which he dismissed my agency in the decision stoked the fire I'd been carefully banking for months. I thought about tomorrow, about the look that would cross his face when he realized who exactly he'd been sleeping next to, and condescending to, all these years. You're right, I said finally. Things can't continue as they are. He mistook my meaning, his face lighting up with boyish enthusiasm that reminded me of the man I'd fallen in love with years ago. That's my girl. Let's head back out. Mark's breaking out the good scotch. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of performative socializing. I played my role perfectly, the supportive if slightly underwhelming wife, while inside I rehearsed tomorrow's carefully orchestrated revelation. By the time we returned home, Greg was loose from expensive scotch and brimming with plans for his expanded role at Everglade. I let him talk, knowing each confident pronouncement would be rendered obsolete in less than 12 hours. The timing couldn't be better, he was saying as we prepared for bed. The promotion, the reorganization. It's like the universe is telling us to start our family now. I smiled tightly, setting my alarm for 5:30 a.m., 3 hours before Greg would wake. The universe works in mysterious ways. He caught me around the waist, pulling me against him. Despite everything, my body responded to his touch. 5 years of shared intimacy couldn't be erased by the growing chasm between us. I know I'm hard on you sometimes, he murmured against my hair. I just want what's best for us, for you. That was the cruel complexity of it. In his mind, he truly believed he was acting out of love. His certainty that he knew better than I did what would fulfill me wasn't malice. It was a kind of blindness that had infected our marriage from the beginning. I know, I said, the words catching in my throat. For a brief moment, I wondered if I should call everything off, the revelation, the corporate reshuffling that would place him directly under my authority. Maybe there was still something here worth salvaging. But then he added, Tomorrow's going to change everything, Em. My career is finally taking off. No more worrying about your little business ventures. You can focus on what really matters. And just like that, the moment of doubt passed. Tomorrow would indeed change everything, but not in the way Greg imagined. Get some sleep, I said, extracting myself from his embrace. Big day tomorrow. As Greg's breathing deepened into sleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling, mentally reviewing every detail of the plan we'd spent months perfecting. The reorganization announcement would come at 9 a.m., followed by individual meetings with key personnel, including the new VP of Operations, whose promotion would be rescinded before he even had time to update his LinkedIn profile. My secure phone vibrated one last time. Sarah again. Final question. Do we use your married name or your professional name for the introduction? I considered for a moment, looking at my sleeping husband. The man who'd dismissed my ambitions, belittled my work, and assumed I would eventually bend to his vision of our life together. Both, I texted back. He needs to understand exactly who he's been underestimating. Sarah's reply was immediate and satisfying. Perfect. Sleep well, boss. Tomorrow we reclaim your narrative. I set the phone aside and closed my eyes, ready for the few hours of sleep before my alarm would signal the beginning of the end of my double life. Tomorrow, the lazy housewife would step into the light as Emma Chen Harmon, CEO of Horizon Technologies and new owner of Everglade Software. Tomorrow, my husband would discover exactly what I'd been doing while he thought I was failing at laundry. Tomorrow, everything would change. Morning arrived with the soft chime of my alarm at 5:30 a.m. I silenced it quickly, glancing at Greg's sleeping form. He wouldn't stir for hours, not until his own alarm at 8:30, giving him just enough time to shower, dress, and arrive at the PAO office for the 9 a.m. company-wide meeting he assumed would herald his promotion. I slipped from bed with practiced stealth, retrieving the outfit I'd hidden in the back of my closet. A tailored Armani suit in deep charcoal, paired with a silk blouse the color of arterial blood. Power clothes for a power move. In the guest bathroom, I transformed myself from Emma Harmon, underachieving housewife, into Emma Chen, CEO. My makeup was precise, my hair swept into a sleek chignon, my grandmother's jade earrings, family heirlooms. Greg had never seen, completing the look. The woman in the mirror was a stranger to my husband, though she was more authentically me than the woman he'd been married to for 5 years. I was out of the house by 6:15, my designer briefcase containing everything I would need for the day ahead. The early morning air held a crispness that felt like possibility, like the cleansing breath before speaking a long-held truth. Sarah was waiting when I arrived at Horizon's downtown headquarters, a sleek glass tower that Greg had driven past, countless times without ever knowing its significance in our life. "Everything's in place," she said instead of a greeting, falling into step beside me as I moved through the secure executive entrance. "The Everglade management team has been notified of a mandatory 9 a.m. meeting. Legal has the paperwork ready. HR has prepared individual transition packets. And Greg's promotion paperwork?" I asked, stepping into the private elevator that would take us to the executive floor. Sarah's smile was slight but satisfied. "Shredded. The official record now shows his performance review was scheduled for today, with no recommendation for advancement." The elevator doors slid open to reveal the executive suite, my domain for the past 7 years, though my husband believed I spent my days attempting crafts and failing at housework. "The board is assembled in the conference room," Sarah continued. "They're eager to finally meet the mysterious spouse you've kept hidden all these years." Unlike Greg, my board of directors knew I was married. They knew I kept my professional and personal lives separate for complex reasons. What they didn't know, until today, was that my husband worked for a company we had just acquired, or that he had no idea who I really was. "Let's not keep them waiting," I said, squaring my shoulders and heading for the large conference room that overlooked the city. Inside, 12 men and women rose as I entered, some of the sharpest minds in the industry, all of whom respected me for my business acumen rather than my domestic skills. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Good morning," I began, taking my place at the head of the table. "Today marks a significant transition for Horizon Technologies and for me personally. As you know, our acquisition of Everglade Software completes our strategic expansion into enterprise solutions. What you don't know is that this acquisition has personal implications." I paused, meeting each gaze directly. My husband, Greg Harmon, is Everglade's current Director of Project Management, soon to be their VP of Operations, or so he believes. He has no idea that I am the CEO of Horizon. He has no idea that I am the CEO of anything at all. The room remained silent, professional masks hiding whatever surprise they might feel. Today, that changes. Today, the careful separation I've maintained between my professional and personal lives ends. I want to be transparent about why this is happening now and what it means for our company moving forward. For the next 20 minutes, I laid out the situation with clinical precision, my reasons for initially keeping my career secret, how Greg's attitudes had reinforced that decision, and why the acquisition of Everglade necessitated the truth finally coming to light. "I don't take this step lightly," I concluded. "I understand it may raise questions about my judgment or my personal life. Those questions are fair. What I ask is that you judge me on the results I've delivered for this company, not on the complexities of my marriage." Robert Chen, no relation, though the coincidence of our surnames had occasionally proved useful, spoke first. As chairman of the board, his opinion carried significant weight. "Emma, in the 7 years you've led Horizon, you've quadrupled our market value and positioned us as an industry leader. Your personal arrangements are your business. Our only concern is whether this revelation will impact the Everglade integration." "It won't," I assured him, grateful for his pragmatism. "I've prepared extensively for today's announcement. Every contingency has been accounted for, including the possibility that my husband may choose to resign rather than remain with the company." "And if he does?" asked Diane Fujita, our longest-serving board member. "Then we proceed with the integration as planned, minus one mid-level executive who was already on thin ice based on his performance reviews." I kept my voice steady, though the thought of Greg walking away from the company and possibly from our marriage created a hollow feeling I wasn't entirely prepared for. Robert nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Then I believe I speak for the board when I say we stand behind you. The acquisition makes strategic sense, regardless of the personal complications." The others murmured agreement, and with that, the meeting shifted to standard acquisition protocols. For the next hour, we reviewed integration timelines, personnel decisions, and financial projections. By the time we concluded, it was 8:30, precisely, when Greg would be waking up at home, blissfully unaware that his world was about to change. "The Everglade executive team will be arriving soon," Sarah informed me as the board members filed out. "They've been directed to the main conference room on 12. Security has been briefed to escort Greg directly to your office when he arrives." I nodded, a sudden tightness in my chest making it difficult to speak. After years of planning, of careful separation and secret keeping, the moment of truth was almost here. "Second thoughts?" Sarah asked quietly once we were alone. "No," I said, though the word came out less certain than I'd intended. "It's time for the truth. I'm tired of living a double life." "You could have told him privately," she pointed out, not for the first time. "This public reveal is dramatic." "It's necessary," I countered. "You've seen the reports from Everglade, the company culture, the systematic sidelining of female employees, the pay disparities. Greg's department is one of the worst offenders. He needs to understand that his actions have consequences, professionally and personally." Sarah nodded, though her expression remained concerned. "Just remember that after today, there's no going back. Whatever happens with Greg, whatever happens with your marriage, this moment changes everything." "I know." I checked my watch. 8:45. 15 minutes until the company-wide announcement. Let's proceed as planned. The next quarter hour passed in a blur of final preparations. I reviewed my notes for the announcement, approved last-minute personnel changes, and tried to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. At precisely 8:57, my private line rang. Sarah's voice was terse. "He's here. Security is bringing him up now, 3 minutes early, so like Greg, always punctual for what he deemed important." I smoothed my suit jacket, took a steadying breath, and positioned myself behind my desk. The massive mahogany piece that had been featured in last month's Business Insider profile of America's most influential CEOs under 40. The knock came at exactly 9 a.m. "Enter!" I called, my voice steady despite the thundering of my heart. The door opened to reveal Greg, impeccably dressed in his best suit, the one I'd bought him for his last birthday. His expression was one of confusion, quickly transitioning to annoyance as he was escorted into my office by Sarah and a security officer. "There's been some mistake," he was saying, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he used when he thought someone was wasting his time. "I'm supposed to be in a company meeting about—" He stopped abruptly as his eyes found me behind the desk. For a long moment he simply stared, his brain visibly struggling to reconcile the image before him with the woman he believed he knew. "Emma?" he finally managed, the single word laden with confusion. "Hello, Greg," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "Please, have a seat. We have a lot to discuss before the company announcement." He remained standing, his gaze darting around the office, taking in the awards on the walls, the view of the city, the nameplate on my desk that read, "Emma Chen Harmon, Chief Executive Officer." "What is this?" he demanded. "What are you doing here? Whose office is this?" "Mine," I said simply. "This is my office, Greg. I'm the CEO of Horizon Technologies, and as of last week, Horizon is the parent company of Everglade Software." The color drained from his face as understanding began to dawn. "That's not possible. You don't—" "I don't what? Work? Lead? Succeed?" I folded my hands on the desk. "I think you'll find I do all three quite effectively." Greg sank into the chair as if his legs had suddenly given out, his expression cycling rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and the first edges of anger. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been lying to me?" And there it was, the crux of it all. Not shock at my success, not admiration for what I'd built, but immediate focus on how my achievements affected him. "I haven't been lying," I corrected, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. "I've been selectively sharing information about my professional life since before we were married." 7 years, Sarah interjected quietly from her position by the door. "Emma founded Horizon 7 years ago. You've been married for 5. Greg's head snapped toward her, then back to me, his eyes narrowing. 7 years? You've been pretending to be some struggling housewife for 7 years while secretly running a company? His voice rose with each word. "Do you have any idea how that makes me look?" And there it was. The reaction I'd anticipated but still hoped wouldn't come. Not anger at being deceived, but concern about his image. "This isn't about how it makes you look, Greg. It's about how you've behaved toward me for years. It's about comments like calling me a lazy housewife when I've been building and running a successful company." He flinched at that, though whether from genuine regret or simply from having his words thrown back at him, I couldn't tell. "If this is some kind of joke—" "It's not a joke," I cut him off firmly. "In approximately—" I checked my watch. 2 minutes, a company-wide announcement will go out to all Everglade employees informing them of the acquisition by Horizon Technologies. It will also introduce me as the CEO of the parent company. The implications of this were visibly landing now, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror. "You can't—" "I can, and I have." I pushed a folder across the desk toward him. "These are the details of the reorganization. You'll note that your promotion to VP of Operations has been rescinded pending performance review. Greg stared at the folder as if it might bite him, making no move to take it. Who reports to whom in this new structure? He asked, his voice tight. You report directly to the head of integration, who reports to the COO, who reports to me. I held his gaze steadily, which means, professionally speaking, you now report to me. The color that had drained from his face now flooded back, a deep red suffusing his features. This is insane. You're my wife. Yes, I agreed. And I'm also your boss's boss's boss. That's the reality now, Greg. The question is whether you can accept it or whether you'd prefer to tender your resignation. For a long moment, he simply stared at me, as if trying to see the woman he thought he'd married beneath the poised executive before him. Then, without warning, he stood, knocking the chair backward. You think I'm going to work for you? After you've been lying to me for our entire marriage? His voice was rising dangerously. This is Mr. Harmon, Sarah interrupted, smoothly. I should remind you that this conversation is being recorded as part of standard security protocols. Your reaction will be noted in your personnel file. That brought him up short. Greg was nothing if not image-conscious, and the thought of his outburst being documented seemed to penetrate the fog of his anger. This isn't over, he said, his voice dropping to a furious whisper. Not by a long shot. With that, he turned and strode toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. I trusted you, he said, not looking back at me. I supported you. The irony of his perception was almost painful. Did you, Greg? Did you really? He had no answer for that, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the awards on my wall. Sarah watched him go, then turned to me with a raised eyebrow. That went about as well as expected. I sank back in my chair, the adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation beginning to ebb. He'll be back, I said, though whether I was trying to convince Sarah or myself, I wasn't entirely sure. Once he processes everything, he'll come back, and we'll talk like adults. Sarah's expression suggested she was less convinced, but she nodded anyway. The company announcement is going out now. Are you ready for Phase 2? Phase 2, the public introduction, the meetings with the Everglade executive team, the beginning of the integration process that would reshape both companies. There was no turning back now. I'm ready, I said, rising from my desk and smoothing my suit. Let's go reintroduce me to my husband's colleagues. As we walked toward the conference room where the Everglade executives waited, I thought about Greg's face when he'd realized the truth. Not just about my career, but about the fundamental imbalance that had defined our marriage. Today was about more than a corporate acquisition or a personal revelation. It was about reclaiming my narrative, both professionally and personally. The lazy housewife was stepping fully into her power, and nothing would ever be the same. The Everglade executive team rose as I entered the conference room, 12 men and 1 woman, all wearing nearly identical expressions of controlled shock. Word traveled fast in corporate America, especially when that word was that their company had been acquired and their new CEO was the wife of one of their managers. Good morning, I began, taking my position at the head of the table with Sarah, at my right hand. I'm Emma Chen Harmon, CEO of Horizon Technologies and, as of last week, the parent company of Everglade Software. Mark Richardson, Greg's friend from the drinks party just last night, was staring at me with undisguised disbelief, his mouth slightly open. I met his gaze directly, watching as he quickly looked down at his notepad. I understand this comes as a surprise on multiple levels, I continued smoothly. The acquisition itself has been in progress for some time, but I recognize that my personal connection to Everglade may raise questions. Diana Hughes, the lone woman on the executive team and Everglade's HR director, was the first to speak. Ms. Chen, or should I say Mrs. Harmon, perhaps you could clarify exactly what this means for the organizational structure moving forward. Smart woman, cutting straight to what mattered most to everyone in the room. Who would still have jobs? Tomorrow. It's Ms. Chen professionally, though the legal documents do reflect my full name, I replied. As for the organizational structure, you'll each receive detailed briefings following this meeting. The short version is that Everglade will maintain operational independence while integrating into Horizon's broader corporate framework. I nodded to Sarah, who began distributing folders to each executive. These packets contain the initial integration, timelines, reporting structures, and transition plans. You'll note that most leadership positions remain intact, though some redundancies will need to be addressed. Mark Richardson finally found his voice. And Greg? What happens to him in this new structure? The question hung in the air, laden with implications. Was I here for corporate vengeance? Would I use my position to punish my husband? Mr. Harmon's position is being evaluated based on the same criteria as every other employee, I said evenly. His performance metrics, leadership evaluations, and team outcomes will determine his future with the company. Nothing more, nothing less. It wasn't entirely true, of course. Greg's position was complicated by his personal relationship with me, but they didn't need to know the details of our marriage. You'll also note, I continued, turning the page in my own folder, that effective immediately, all salary disparities based on gender are being equalized. Our audit found significant discrepancies that will be rectified in the next pay cycle. Diana. Hughes couldn't quite hide her small smile at that. Based on the preliminary audits we'd conducted, she'd been making 22% less than her male counterparts, despite having been at the company 3 years longer. Now, let's discuss the transition timeline. For the next hour, we moved methodically through the integration plan. Some executives asked pointed questions. Others remained silently calculating their positions in the new order. Mark Richardson alternated between sullen silence and thinly veiled challenges to the acquisition strategy. With all due respect, he said after I'd outlined the new product roadmap, some of these initiatives were already underway at Everglade. It seems like Horizon is simply taking credit for existing work. Actually, Mr. Richardson, I countered. If you'll look at Appendix C, you'll see that many of these initiatives were originally pitched by Horizon to Everglade through various channels over the past 18 months. Initiatives that were repeatedly rejected by your department, if I recall correctly. His face flushed at the public correction. What I didn't add was that several of those rejected initiatives had been designed specifically to test Everglade's receptiveness to innovation. Tests they had failed consistently, making them an ideal acquisition target. As the meeting concluded, I addressed them one final time. Change is always challenging, but I believe this integration will strengthen both companies. My door is open to each of you during this transition. That said, I paused, meeting each gaze directly. I expect professionalism and commitment to our shared goals. Personal feelings about the acquisition or my marriage have no place in our business discussions. Are we clear? Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table, though the tension remained palpable. As the executives filed out, Sarah leaned in close. Richardson is going to be a problem. He's close with Greg, and his team's ethics violations are significant. Flag his department for priority audit, I replied quietly, and schedule my one-on-one with him for tomorrow rather than next week. Better to address potential resistance early. Diana Hughes lingered after the others had gone, hesitating by the door. Ms. Chen, might I have a moment? I nodded, curious. Of all the Everglade executives, Hughes had the most to gain from Horizon's takeover, given our strong policies on gender equity. Once we were alone, she spoke candidly. I've been at Everglade for 9 years. In that time, I've filed 17 reports of gender discrimination and pay inequity. All were dismissed or buried. I wanted to thank you for addressing this directly. Her sincerity was touching, and an important reminder of why this acquisition mattered beyond my personal situation with Greg. The inequities at Everglade were a factor in our acquisition decision, I acknowledged. Your documentation was actually Quite helpful during our due diligence process. Her eyes widened slightly. My documentation? Anonymous whistleblower reports still have signatures to those who know how to look, I said with a small smile. Your detailed records of systemic discrimination were compelling evidence that Everglade needed new leadership. She returned the smile, a look of vindication crossing her features. And Greg, if you don't mind my asking, did he know about these reports? The question cut close to the bone. Had Greg been aware of the discrimination happening under his watch? Or worse, had he actively participated in it? That's part of what we're evaluating, I said carefully. Why do you ask? Hughes hesitated, then pulled a thumb drive from her pocket. This contains emails from the last 3 years between various directors and VPs, including discussions of how to prevent women from advancing into leadership roles. Greg is copied on several threads, though his participation is limited to reading, not responding. I accepted the thumb drive, its small weight suddenly feeling much heavier. Thank you for bringing this forward. I'll ensure it's reviewed thoroughly. After she left, I sat alone in the conference room, turning the thumb drive over in my hands. Had Greg been complicit in the systemic discrimination at Everglade? The thought made my stomach tighten. It was one thing to be condescending to his wife in the privacy of our home. It was another to participate in structural barriers against all women in the workplace. Sarah returned, breaking my reverie. Greg's back, she said simply. Security called up. He's demanding to see you. I slipped the thumb drive into my pocket. When it rains, it pours. Send him up in 15 minutes. I need to review something first. Alone in my office, I connected the drive to my secure laptop and quickly scanned through the emails Hughes had provided. The conversations were damning. Senior leaders at Everglade explicitly discussing ways to sideline female employees, justify lower salaries, and maintain the boys' club atmosphere. Greg's name appeared in the recipient list of several emails, though, as Hughes had said, I couldn't find any replies from him. One exchange from 6 months ago caught my attention. Mark Richardson had written to the executive team about a promising female engineer being considered for promotion. Let's be real, she's qualified on paper. But can we trust her to handle client meetings? Emotions get in the way. Greg, back. Me up here. Remember Lisa from marketing? Greg hadn't responded to the email chain, at least not digitally. Had he backed up Mark in person? Had he remained silent, allowing the discrimination to continue unchallenged, or had he objected privately? A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. 15 minutes had passed quickly. Come in, I called, closing the laptop and composing myself. Greg entered, his earlier rage seemingly replaced by cold calculation. He'd clearly taken the time to process the situation and formulate a strategy, always his strength in business, if not in our marriage. That was quite a performance, he said, remaining standing despite the chair available to him. Keeping your identity secret, acquiring my company, orchestrating this whole reveal. Very dramatic. It wasn't intended as drama, I countered. The acquisition makes strategic sense for both companies. The timing of revealing my identity was necessitated by the finalization of the deal. Bullshit. The word was soft but cutting. You could have told me at any point in the last 7 years. You chose today, in front of my colleagues, to maximize my humiliation. There was some truth to that, though not in the way he imagined. I had chosen a public revelation, but not for petty revenge. Rather to ensure there could be no going back to the imbalanced dynamic that had defined our marriage. Perhaps, I acknowledged. Just as you chose to mock my supposed lack of ambition in front of your friends last night, not knowing I'd built a company worth 9 figures while you thought I was struggling with laundry. A muscle ticked in his jaw. So this is payback? No, Greg. This is reality. The reality is that I founded and built Horizon Technologies. The reality is that Horizon has acquired Everglade, And the reality is that this creates a professional relationship between us that we need to address. Address? He gave a humorless laugh. You want me to keep working here? Under you? That's your decision, I said evenly. Your performance. Reviews have been mixed. Your teams deliver results, but employee satisfaction scores are concerning, particularly among female team members. His eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting I discriminate against women? Because that's rich coming from the woman who's been living a double life. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm sharing the data. I pulled a performance summary from my desk and held it out to him. Your retention rate for female engineers is 37% below the company average. Promotion rates show similar disparities. He made no move to take the document. Corporate metrics can show whatever story you want them to tell. You should know that better than anyone. The implication that I'd manipulated data to target him was both predictable and disappointing. Classic Greg. Deflect, distract, make. The other person defend themselves rather than addressing the actual issue. The numbers aren't the only concern, I said, placing the document back on my desk. I've received some troubling emails about conversations you've been part of regarding women in leadership positions. That got his attention. His posture stiffened slightly. What emails? Instead of answering directly, I asked, do you remember an engineer named Aisha Patel? She was up for promotion 6 months ago. A flash of recognition crossed his face, quickly masked. Vaguely, there are dozens of engineers. She left Everglade after being passed over for promotion 3 times despite consistently outperforming her male colleagues. Mark Richardson specifically asked for your input on blocking her advancement. Greg's expression remained carefully neutral. If you're implying I blocked a qualified candidate because she was a woman, you're wrong. Promotion decisions are made by committees, not individuals. And yet the pattern across your department is consistent. Women advance more slowly, leave more frequently, and report higher rates of having their ideas dismissed or attributed to male colleagues. He spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. If there are systematic issues at Everglade, they predated my arrival. I've always supported qualified candidates regardless of gender. Like you supported me? I wanted to ask, but kept the thought to myself. Instead, I changed tack. Let me be clear, Greg. I'm not here to fire you or force you out. I'm here to lead this company forward. If you want to be part of that future, you'll need to address these performance concerns and adapt to the new corporate culture we're implementing. A culture where my wife is secretly my boss? He countered. That seems like a conflict of interest. It is, I acknowledged. Which is why, effective immediately, you'll be reporting to Diana Hughes. She'll be overseeing the integration of your department. The irony wasn't lost on him, being placed under the supervision of a woman he'd likely helped keep from advancing. His jaw tightened visibly. And if I refuse? Then you're welcome to tender your resignation. Your severance would be standard for your position. 4 weeks, plus accrued vacation time. We stared at each other across the desk, the years of our marriage seemingly compressed into this single tense moment. Had it always been leading to this confrontation? Had the seeds of this power struggle been planted the first time he'd dismissed my ambitions? Finally, Greg spoke, his voice carefully controlled. I need time to think. Take the rest of the day. I expect your decision by tomorrow morning. I kept my tone professional, though my heart was racing beneath my composed exterior. And Greg, whatever you decide professionally, we also need to discuss what this means for our marriage. A flicker of genuine emotion crossed his face. Pain, confusion, perhaps even a hint of regret. Is there still a marriage to discuss? The question hung between us, weighted with 5 years of shared history, betrayals both spoken and unspoken, and the uncertain path ahead. I don't know, I answered honestly. That depends on whether we can find a way forward that respects who we both truly are, not who we've pretended to be. He nodded once, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, I never responded to Mark's email about Aisha Patel. I told him in person that she deserved the promotion but was outvoted. With that, he was gone, leaving me to wonder how much of our marriage and his professional character I had truly understood. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, integration planning, and crisis management. News of the acquisition had spread throughout both companies, along with increasingly elaborate rumors about my relationship with Greg. By mid-afternoon, Sarah had implemented a temporary communication policy directing all questions to the appropriate department heads rather than allowing speculation to run rampant. At 5 o'clock, I found myself standing at my office window, watching the city transition from workday to evening. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Richardson requesting meeting tomorrow a.m. Says it's urgent. I frowned, typing back. Approved, 9:08 a.m. Have security on standby. Mark's loyalty to Greg made him unpredictable, and his ethical violations made him dangerous. Another text arrived, this one from a number I didn't immediately recognize. We need to talk. Not at the office. Not at home. Neutral ground. G. Greg, using a new phone number. Smart. He knew his company device would be monitored. I considered ignoring the message, but that would only delay the inevitable conversation we needed to have. I typed back, The Meridian, 8 p.m., private dining room. The Meridian was an upscale restaurant downtown with discreet private rooms often used for sensitive business discussions. Neither of us would make a scene there. His reply was immediate. I'll be there. By 7:50 p.m., I was seated in the Meridian's smallest private dining room, a glass of water untouched before me. I'd changed from my power suit into a simple black dress, still professional, but less overtly corporate. This wasn't a business meeting after all. It was a reckoning between husband and wife. Greg arrived precisely at 8 and his punctuality, a constant in both his professional and personal life. He'd also changed clothes, I noted, from his business suit to casual slacks and a sweater. The outfit I'd bought him last Christmas, ironically. Thank you for coming, he said formally, as if we were strangers meeting for the first time. Would you like something to drink? I offered, gesturing to the server hovering discreetly near the door. Scotch. Neat. He sat across from me, his posture rigid. Once the server had departed, he continued. I've been thinking about what you said. About our marriage. About whether there's anything left to salvage. His directness surprised me. I'd expected more anger, more accusations before we reached this point. And? I prompted when he didn't immediately continue. And I realized something, he said, meeting my gaze directly. I don't know who you are. The woman I thought I married. The woman who struggled with basic household management, who needed my guidance and support. She doesn't exist. She never did. The server returned with his scotch, interrupting momentarily. When we were alone again, I responded. You're right that I've hidden significant parts of myself from you. But you're wrong to think that the woman you married doesn't exist. She's sitting right here. Is she? He took a sip of his scotch. The Emma I thought I knew couldn't manage our household budget without my help. The real Emma runs a 9-figure company. The Emma you thought you knew was a carefully constructed facade, I acknowledged. But my reasons for creating that facade weren't about deceiving you. At least not initially. They were about protecting myself. Protecting yourself from what? From me? His tone hovered between incredulous and offended. What did I ever do except support you? And there it was, the fundamental disconnect that had defined our marriage from the beginning, his genuine belief that his condescension constituted support. Greg, do you remember when we first met? At the charity gala for tech education? He nodded, clearly unsure where I was going with this. Do you remember what you Said when Thomas Winters introduced me as a tech entrepreneur? His brow furrowed in concentration, then cleared as the memory surfaced. I joked that you didn't look like the typical hoodie-wearing startup bro. No, I corrected gently. You said, and I quote, "Another girl boss with a glorified Instagram shop, I bet." Then you laughed with your friends and walked away. He had the grace to look embarrassed. I was drunk, and I apologized later when Thomas reintroduced us. You did, I agreed. And then, during our first date, you spent 20 minutes explaining basic cloud computing to me after I mentioned working in tech. I was trying to mansplain my own industry to me, I finished for him. And every time I tried to redirect the conversation, you spoke over me. By the end of that date, I'd made a decision. If we were going to have any future, I needed to hide my success to protect your ego. His face flushed with anger. That's not fair. You made assumptions about me without giving me a chance. Perhaps, I conceded. But those assumptions were confirmed repeatedly throughout our marriage. Every time you mocked my little business ventures. Every time you dismissed my suggestions about finances or investments. Every time you compared me unfavorably to your mother for not meeting your domestic expectations. Greg stared down at his scotch, conflicting emotions playing across his face. So this was some kind of elaborate test? One I was designed to fail? No, I said firmly. It wasn't a test. It was a compromise I made because I loved you. Because despite everything, I saw something in you worth loving. A heavy silence fell between us, filled with the weight of 5 years of misunderstandings and hidden truths. I've made a decision about my position at Everglade, Greg finally said, changing the subject slightly. I'm staying. The declaration surprised me. Are you sure that's wise? Working under your wife's company? I'm not doing it for you, he interrupted. I'm doing it for me. I've worked hard to build my career at Everglade. I'm not walking away because things got complicated. I studied his face, trying to discern his true motivations. Was this about pride, stubbornness? Or was there something more, a genuine desire to prove himself on merit rather than marital connection? If you stay, there can be no special treatment, I warned. You'll be held to the same standards as every other employee. Higher standards even, given the potential perception of nepotism. I don't want special treatment, he said firmly. In fact, I want the opposite. I want to prove that I deserve my position based on my work, not my relationship to you. Something shifted between us in that moment. A small realignment of understanding. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, we were seeing each other clearly. Not completely, not perfectly, but without the distortions of my fabricated helplessness or his assumed superiority. And what about us? I asked quietly. What about our marriage? Greg set down his glass, his expression thoughtful. I don't know if we can fix what's broken between us. The trust is gone on both sides, but I'm not ready to walk away without trying. What does trying look like to you? I pressed, needing specifics rather than vague intentions. Counseling, for a start, he suggested. Separate living arrangements while we work through this. Complete honesty moving forward. It was so rational, so measured, so unlike the reactive Greg I'd expected to face tonight. Had I underestimated him all these years? Had my own deceptions prevented me from seeing his capacity for growth? I think those are reasonable steps, I agreed cautiously. But counseling and honesty only work if we're both committed to examining our own contributions to the problem. You mean my sexism and condescension? He asked with a hint of his earlier defensiveness. Among other things, I acknowledged, just as I need to examine my dishonesty and the walls I've built. He nodded slowly, a fragile truce forming between us. So where does that leave us tonight? I considered the question carefully. We couldn't go back to our shared home as if nothing had happened. The foundations of our relationship had been too thoroughly shaken. I have a corporate apartment downtown, I said. I'll stay there for now. You can remain in the house until we decide next steps. And tomorrow? At the office? Tomorrow we're professionals. You report to Diana Hughes. I run the company. Our personal situation remains private. Greg finished his scotch, setting the glass down with finality. It won't be easy. No, I agreed. But nothing worthwhile ever is. As we prepared to leave the restaurant separately, Greg asked one final question, his voice quiet and uncertain. Were you ever happy with me? Or was our entire marriage just an elaborate lie? The question deserved honesty, even if the truth was complicated. There were genuine moments of happiness, Greg. The problem was never that I didn't love you. It was that I couldn't be fully myself with you. And that's no foundation for lasting happiness. He absorbed this, nodding slowly. For what it's worth, I think I would have liked the real Emma, if you'd given me the chance to know her. As he walked away, I wasn't sure if his words offered closure or a new beginning. All I knew was that tomorrow would bring fresh challenges as we navigated the uncharted territory between us. As executives, as spouses, and as two people discovering each other for perhaps the first time. The line between personal and professional had been irrevocably blurred. Now we would see if either relationship could survive in the harsh light of truth. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate apartment, casting geometric patterns across the minimalist furniture. I'd spent a restless night replaying my conversation with Greg, analyzing each word, each expression, searching for clues to what might come next. My phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. Richardson meeting in 30 minutes. Background check complete. Suspicious financial transactions flagged. I frowned, typing back, "Details?" Her response was immediate. Large deposits to an offshore account, following 3 major client deals. Timing aligns with contract modifications that weren't properly documented. The pieces were falling into place. Mark Richardson's ethical violations went beyond casual sexism in emails. He was likely skimming from client contracts, a serious offense that would warrant immediate termination. But Mark was also Greg's closest ally at Everglade. His termination would inevitably be seen as a personal attack, complicating an already delicate situation. Proceed as planned, I messaged Sarah. Meeting recorded. Legal standing by. 40 minutes later, I was seated across from Mark Richardson in my office, watching him shift uncomfortably as I reviewed the financial documents spread between us. These discrepancies are concerning, Mr. Richardson, I said, tapping a highlighted section. Can you explain why the final client invoices exceed the contracted amounts by exactly 4.7% in each case? His forced smile didn't reach his eyes. Scope. Adjustments. Common in our industry. The clients requested additional features after the initial contracts were signed. Interesting, I replied, sliding forward another document. Because the clients signed change orders don't reflect these adjustments. In fact, Novatech specifically denied authorizing any additional charges when we contacted them yesterday. The color drained from his face. There must be some misunderstanding. Greg approved all of these transactions. Check with him if you don't believe me. A predictable deflection. Throw Greg under the bus at the first sign of trouble. We have, I said calmly. Mr. Harmon confirmed that while he signed off on the client invoices, he did so based on documentation you provided. Documentation we've been unable to locate in the company records. Mark's expression hardened. I see what this is. You're targeting me because I'm friends with your husband. This is personal. This isn't personal, Mr. Richardson. This is embezzlement. I closed the folder deliberately. Horizon Technologies has a zero-tolerance policy for financial misconduct. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. You can't do this. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I built the Novatech relationship. I've been with Everglade for 8 years. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings, I continued, unmoved by his outburst. All company devices must be surrendered before you leave the building. As for legal action, that will depend on whether the clients wish to press charges. His face contorted with fury. You think Greg will stand for this? You're destroying his team, humiliating him in front of the entire company. He won't forgive you. I met his gaze steadily. Mr. Harmon's feelings on the matter are irrelevant to your misconduct. Now please exit my office before I call security to remove you. For a moment, I thought he might lunge across the desk. Instead, he leaned forward, voice dropping to a venomous whisper. This isn't over. You think you're so clever with your secret identity and corporate takeover. But I know things about Greg. Things that would destroy whatever's left of your marriage. That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Richardson, I replied evenly. Would you like to clarify your statement for the recording? His eyes darted to the small indicator light on my desk phone, confirming the conversation was being documented. Without another word, he straightened and strode toward the door, nearly colliding with Sarah, who stood just outside. Security is waiting, Mr. Richardson, she said professionally, though her stance suggested she was prepared should he become physically aggressive. After he was escorted away, Sarah returned to my office. That went about as expected. Have his accounts frozen and access revoked, I instructed, and have Diana Hughes prepared to address his team. They'll need reassurance that their jobs aren't in jeopardy. Already done, Sarah confirmed. Greg is waiting outside. He heard the commotion. I nodded, taking a moment to compose myself. The professional necessity of firing Mark couldn't be separated from the personal complications it would create with Greg. Send him in. Greg entered cautiously, his expression unreadable. I just saw Mark being escorted out by security. What happened? Mr. Richardson has been terminated for financial misconduct, I stated simply. The details are confidential, but the evidence was conclusive. Mark? Greg's disbelief seemed genuine. He's been with the company for years. He built half our client relationships, and he's been skimming from those clients for at least 3 of those years, I replied. The audit found multiple instances of invoice padding, money that was diverted to his personal accounts. Greg sank into the chair Mark had vacated, running, a hand through his hair. I signed off on those invoices. Does that mean I'm implicated? The question revealed a vulnerability I hadn't expected, fear for his own position rather than defensive loyalty to his friend. The evidence suggests you were misled, I assured him. Your signatures were based on fraudulent documentation that Richardson provided. Unless the investigation uncovers evidence of your knowing participation, you're not legally exposed. Relief flickered across his features, followed quickly by concern. His team will be in chaos. The Novatech account, Diana Hughes will handle. The transition, I interrupted. She'll meet with the team this morning to address concerns and reallocate responsibilities. The Novatech account will temporarily fall under your direct management until we identify a suitable replacement. Greg nodded slowly, processing the information. This will look targeted. Everyone knows Mark was, my friend. The timing is unfortunate, I acknowledged. But financial misconduct cannot be overlooked, regardless of personal connections. A heavy silence fell between us, laden with the unspoken question of how this would affect our already strained relationship. Did you know? Greg finally asked. Before the acquisition, did you know he was stealing? The question surprised me, not accusatory, but seeking reassurance that I hadn't orchestrated his friend's downfall. We had indications of financial irregularities during due diligence, I admitted. But the specific evidence of embezzlement only emerged during the post-acquisition audit. He seemed to accept this, though uncertainty lingered in his expression. He said things to me. After you revealed yourself yesterday, things about you. I imagine he did, I replied carefully. Mr. Richardson made threatening statements as he was leaving, implying he had information that could damage our marriage. Did he share specifics? Greg's gaze remained fixed on my desk rather than meeting my eyes. He said you've been investigating me for months, that the acquisition was personal, revenge for how I've treated you, that you have a file documenting every disparaging comment I've ever made about you. I couldn't help the small, tired laugh that escaped me. That would be quite a thick file. His head snapped up, hurt flashing across his features before he masked it. That was unfair, I admitted. No, Greg, I don't have a file of your offenses. The acquisition was a business decision based on Everglades' market position and technological assets. Your presence at the company complicated matters, but it wasn't the driving factor. And yet the timing, revealing yourself just as I was expecting a promotion, feels calculated to maximize my humiliation. There was some truth in his observation, though not in the vindictive way he imagined. The revelation was necessary because of the acquisition. The timing was determined by the closure of the deal, not by your promotion schedule. He didn't seem entirely convinced, but nodded anyway. Mark also claimed you've been seeing someone, a co-founder or investor, that your marriage to me was just cover while you built your company. The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed again, but the genuine hurt in Greg's eyes stopped me. That's completely false. There has never been anyone else during our marriage. Why should I believe you? He asked quietly. You've been living a double life for years, lying about your career, your ambitions, your daily activities. Where do the lies stop, Emma? It was a fair question, one I'd been wrestling with myself. I compartmentalized my life, Greg. I presented a false version of my professional identity. But my feelings for you were never fabricated. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. How can I possibly know that? Everything about our relationship feels like quicksand now. What was real? What was performance? The only way forward is through honesty, I said, rising to join him by the window. Complete transparency from this point on. That's what I'm offering. It's your choice whether to accept it. Greg turned to face me, his expression more vulnerable than I'd seen since the early days of our marriage. Mark said one more thing. He said you have someone investigating me, looking for evidence that I've been unfaithful. That accusation cut deeper than the others, not because it was true, but because it revealed how thoroughly Richardson had been poisoning Greg against me, exploiting the fractures in our marriage. That's another lie, I said firmly. I've never doubted your fidelity, Greg. Whatever Richardson's agenda, he's deliberately trying to drive us further apart. Before Greg could respond, my office phone buzzed. Sarah's voice came through the speaker. Ms. Chen, the Everglade integration team is assembled in Conference Room A. They're waiting for your opening remarks. Thank you, Sarah. I'll be right there. I turned back to Greg. We need to continue this conversation later. Will you be home tonight or staying at a hotel? The question hung between us, personal and professional boundaries blurring uncomfortably. I'll be at the house, he said after a moment. We should talk without the corporate backdrop. I nodded, relieved that he was willing to continue the conversation. I'll come by around 8. And Greg, don't let Richardson's accusations fester. If you have questions, ask me directly. As he left my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark Richardson's firing had just made an already complex situation exponentially more difficult. The integration meeting consumed the next 3 hours. A necessary but tedious review of systems alignment, personnel decisions, and transition timelines. Throughout, I was acutely aware of Greg sitting silently at the far end of the conference table, his attention focused on his tablet rather than the discussion at hand. Diana Hughes proved her worth repeatedly, deftly handling questions about departmental restructuring and addressing concerns about the company culture, changes without becoming defensive about Everglades' past practices. By meeting's end, I'd mentally earmarked her for promotion to the executive leadership team once. The integration was complete. Ms. Chen, if I could have a moment. Diana approached as the room cleared, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite the urgency in her voice. Of course. I gestured to the now empty chairs. What's happened? Mark Richardson has been contacting team members, she said once we were seated, making accusations about the acquisition and about you personally. I'd expected this, though perhaps not quite so quickly. What kind of accusations? He's claiming the financial misconduct. Charges are fabricated, a pretext to remove Greg's allies. He's also spreading rumors about your relationship with Greg, suggesting the acquisition was personal revenge. Predictable, if disappointing. How are the teams responding? Mixed, Diana admitted. Some are dismissing it as the accusations of a disgruntled employee. Others, particularly those close to Mark and Greg, are concerned about potential witch hunts. I considered the implications. Richardson's accusations could significantly complicate the already challenging integration if they gained traction. Have HR prepare a company-wide communication addressing the circumstances of Richardson's departure, I decided. Factual, not defensive. Emphasize that all personnel decisions are based on documented performance and conduct, not personal relationships. Diana nodded, making notes on her tablet. There's one more thing. Richardson apparently told several people that Greg was next on the chopping block. It's creating anxiety for his team. Of course, Mark would try to undermine Greg's position, either out of vindictiveness or a misguided attempt to manipulate my husband into opposing the acquisition. I'll speak with Greg about addressing his team directly, I said. He needs to reassure them that his position is secure, provided his performance meets expectations. As Diana left to implement these plans, Sarah entered with her characteristic efficiency. The Novatech CEO is on line 1. They want to discuss the Richardson situation and their contract status. The remainder of the day disappeared in a flurry of damage control, client reassurance, and integration planning. By 6 o'clock, I was mentally exhausted, but had managed to stabilize the immediate fallout from Richardson's termination. The Novatech relationship appeared secure. Greg's team had settled following his direct assurances about their future, and the HR communication had successfully countered the most damaging of Richardson's rumors. As I drove to our house, technically my house, purchased with my money before our marriage, I found myself anxious about the coming conversation with Greg. The professional crises I'd navigated all day were straightforward, compared to the personal complexities awaiting me at home. The house was uncharacteristically dark when I arrived, only a single lamp illuminating the living room. Greg sat in near darkness, a tumbler of scotch in hand. "You're late," he observed as I set my keys on the entryway table. The Novatech situation took longer to resolve than expected, I explained, slipping off my heels. "Have you eaten?" "Not hungry." He took another sip of scotch, the amber liquid catching the meager light. "Richardson's been fired, humiliated, and may face criminal charges. Is that your plan for me too, when I inevitably disappoint you?" So much for a calm, rational discussion. Mark Richardson committed fraud, Greg. He stole from clients and implicated you in the process. His termination has nothing to do with our marriage, doesn't it? He set down his glass with deliberate care. "Your company acquires mine. Your first major action is firing my closest colleague. The message seems pretty clear." I moved to sit across from him, keeping my voice measured. "The timing is unfortunate, but the evidence against Richardson is incontrovertible. Would you prefer I had ignored financial fraud because the perpetrator was friends with my husband?" He had no immediate answer for that. Instead, he changed tack, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I kept thinking today about all the times I talked about work at home, complaining about colleagues, discussing sensitive projects, strategizing about promotions. Was that all intelligence gathering for your takeover?" The question stung, partly because there was a kernel of truth to it. I hadn't actively sought his corporate insights, but I hadn't stopped him from sharing them either. I Compartmentalized, I said carefully. What you shared as my husband stayed separate from my professional decisions. But you remembered it all, he pressed. Used it when necessary. I'm human, Greg. I couldn't unhear information simply because it might someday be relevant to my company. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, studying me with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. Here's what I don't understand. Why the elaborate deception? Why not simply tell me who you were from the beginning? It was the central question, the one I'd asked myself countless times over the years. The answer felt inadequate, even to me. When we first met, I was just starting to build horizon. My previous relationships had taught me that successful women often attract partners who are more interested in their resources than their personalities. I met his gaze directly. Then you made that comment about girl bosses, and I made a split-second decision to hide my success. One offhand comment and you decided I was too sexist to handle your success? His tone was incredulous. It wasn't just one comment. It was a pattern that continued through our relationship. Every time you explained my industry to me, every time you dismissed my career suggestions, every time you compared me to your mother's domestic prowess. He flinched at that last example. I'm not saying I've been perfect, but 5 years of deception seems like an extreme response to some occasional, thoughtless comments. It started small, I admitted. A temporary omission that grew into a permanent facade. Each time I considered telling you the truth, something would happen. You'd make another dismissive comment about female executives, or mock my supposed lack of business acumen, and I'd decide the time wasn't right. So it's my fault you lied? His voice rose slightly. I forced you into deception? No. I shook my head firmly. My choices were my own. But they were made in the context of a relationship where I didn't feel safe revealing my true self. The word safe hung between us, its implications rippling outward. I never threatened you, Greg said quietly, hurt evident in his tone. I never would have hurt you for being successful. Not physically, I agreed, but emotionally. The foundation of our relationship was your assumption of superiority, your belief that you needed to guide and improve me. How would that dynamic have survived if you knew I was running a company more successful than yours would ever be? The harsh truth landed like a physical blow. Greg reached for his scotch, draining the glass before responding. You really think so little of me? That my ego is so fragile I couldn't have celebrated your success? I think, I said carefully, that we built a relationship on false premises. My pretense of needing your guidance, your enjoyment of providing it. We both participated in constructing a dynamic that wasn't healthy, even if we had different reasons for doing so. He was silent for a long moment, turning the empty glass between his fingers. Earlier today, when Richardson was making accusations, Diana Hughes defended you. Said you were the most ethical executive she'd ever worked with. That the changes you were implementing at Everglade were long overdue. The unexpected shift in conversation caught me off guard. Diana is an excellent judge of character. She also said something that's been bothering me all day. Greg set down his glass, meeting my gaze directly. She said that watching how executives treat people with less power tells you everything about their character. That you never know who someone truly is until you see them interact with someone who can't benefit them. I nodded slowly, sensing where this was heading. I've been thinking about how I've treated you, he continued, voice rough with emotion. Believing you had no power, no success of your own. Treating you as someone who needed my guidance rather than my respect. What does that say about my character? The vulnerability in his question was unexpected, a crack in the defensive anger he'd maintained since the revelation. For the first time since this began, I glimpsed the possibility of genuine reflection rather than wounded pride. It says you have patterns to unlearn, I answered honestly. As do I. Neither of us has been our authentic self in this marriage. Greg stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked our manicured backyard. I requested a temporary reassignment today. Diana approved it. The statement caught me off guard. To which department? The Tokyo expansion team, he said, still facing the window. 3 months in Japan, overseeing the integration of the engineering teams. I leave next week. I see. I processed this unexpected development. And you made this decision without discussing it with me? He turned, a wry smile touching his lips. Ironic complaint, coming from you. Fair point. May I ask why? We need space, he said simply. Professional and personal. I need to figure out who I am at Everglade without being the CEO's husband. You need to establish your leadership without navigating our personal complications. The logic was sound, though the decision still stung. And our marriage? Are we separating? Greg returned to his seat, the physical distance between us symbolizing the emotional gulf we needed to bridge. I don't know what we are, Emma. I don't know if what we had was real enough to save. But I do know we can't figure it out while navigating a corporate integration and office politics. So 3 months apart, I summarized, an unexpected hollowness forming in my chest. And then what? And then we reassess. With distance and perspective. Maybe meet on neutral ground. Not as CEO and employee, not as husband and wife, just as two people deciding if there's anything worth rebuilding. The proposal was rational, measured, perhaps the most mature approach to our tangled situation. Yet part of me wanted to object, to insist we could work through this without such a dramatic separation. That part, I realized, was the Emma who had spent years accommodating and adapting rather than asserting her needs. I think that's wise, I said instead, embracing the authenticity I'd promised myself. 3 months. No contact about personal matters unless absolutely necessary. We focus on our respective professional responsibilities. He nodded, relief evident in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. Diana briefed me on the Tokyo operation. She's impressive. Should have been in leadership years ago. She will be now, I confirmed. Her promotion to the executive team will be announced next week. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. Good. Everglade needs more leaders like her. We lapsed into silence, the major decisions made but countless smaller questions still hanging. Between us. Who would live where? How would we explain this to friends and family? What would happen after the 3 months? I'll stay at the corporate apartment until you leave, I finally said. You can use this time to prepare for Tokyo. After you depart, I'll move back here. Greg nodded, the practicalities easier to address than the emotions underlying them. My mother's birthday dinner is next weekend. She's expecting both of us. Patricia Harmon, the domestic goddess whose standards I'd never measured up to. I'll send my regrets. Family events would be complicated right now. She'll ask questions, Greg warned. Then answer them honestly, I suggested. Or don't. That's your decision to make. Another silence fell, this one more comfortable than the last. Whatever happened next, we had established a framework, space, honesty, and eventually, a reckoning. It's getting late, Greg finally said. You should go if you want to avoid rush hour traffic. I nodded, gathering my purse. At the doorway, I paused, turning back to him. For what it's worth, Greg, I do believe there was real love between us. Complicated, flawed, built on shaky foundations, but real nonetheless. He didn't respond immediately, his expression thoughtful. Maybe, he said finally. Or maybe we both loved the idea of each other, rather than the reality. I guess we'll find out in 3 months. As I drove back to my corporate apartment, the guy, city lights blurring through unshed tears, I wondered if he was right. Had we ever truly known each other? Or had we simply fallen in love with carefully constructed facades, destined to crumble once exposed to the light of truth? 3 months would tell. 3 months of authentic existence on both sides. Him finding his professional identity beyond my shadow, me leading without the exhausting double life. 3 months to determine if Greg and Emma, the real versions, not the masks we'd worn, had any future together at all. 3 months can change everything or nothing at all. For me, it was somewhere in between. The Tokyo expansion proceeded smoothly under Greg's leadership. His weekly reports were thorough, professional, and completely devoid of personal content, exactly as we'd agreed. From 12 time zones away, I watched him excel in ways I might never have witnessed had we maintained our previous dynamic. The irony wasn't lost on me. Only by stepping fully into my power had I created space for him to demonstrate his. Diana Hughes had blossomed in her new executive role, systematically addressing the gender disparities that had plagued Everglade for years. Under her leadership, the integration of our corporate cultures progressed more smoothly than our financial projections had anticipated. The latest numbers from Tokyo, Sarah said, dropping a folder on my desk one rainy April morning. Greg's team has completed the integration 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Client retention at 97%, well above projections. I flipped through the report, noting Greg's precise analysis and thoughtful recommendations. His management style had evolved, less autocratic, more collaborative. Employee feedback mentioned his willingness to listen, particularly to the female engineers who had previously been sidelined. He's been reading feminist business literature, Sarah commented, noting my surprise. Diana mentioned it during their last video conference. Apparently, he's been studying gender dynamics in the workplace. The information both pleased and unsettled me. Greg was changing, growing, but for himself or for me? And why did I care about his motivations when the results benefited everyone? Has he mentioned his return plans? I asked, aiming for casual professionalism. Sarah's knowing look suggested I hadn't quite succeeded. He's requested a 1-week extension to oversee final client handoffs. Should return stateside on the 30th. 10 days away. After nearly 3 months of silence on personal matters, I would face my husband again. A husband who was simultaneously my employee, a stranger, and the man I'd built a life with on foundations of half-truths and omissions. The board is impressed with his performance, Sarah added. Robert Chen specifically mentioned his handling of the Nakamura account integration. As they should be, I acknowledged. His work has been exemplary. And how are you feeling about seeing him again? Sarah's question broke our unspoken agreement to maintain professional boundaries around my marriage. I considered deflecting, then opted for honesty. Anxious, hopeful, confused. Pick your emotion. I've cycled through them all. Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. He's been asking questions about your early days building Horizon. Not prying, professional curiosity about your leadership approach. This surprised me. To whom? Diana, mostly. Sometimes me when we have our weekly check-ins. He seems genuinely interested in understanding your journey. The Greg I'd married would have been threatened by my success, not curious about it. Whether the change was genuine evolution or strategic adaptation remained to be seen. Has he said anything about... I trailed off, unsure how to phrase the question. About your marriage? Sarah finished for me. Not directly, but he declined an invitation to join the Tokyo office permanently. Said he had unfinished business in the States. What that unfinished business entailed, divorce papers or reconciliation, was the question that had kept me awake for weeks. The Richardson situation has been fully resolved, Sarah continued, changing the subject. The settlement agreement was finalized yesterday. No criminal charges in exchange for full restitution and a non-disclosure agreement. Mark Richardson had eventually capitulated once confronted with the full evidence of his financial misconduct. His initial threats to expose Greg had proven empty. Whatever he thought he knew about my husband hadn't materialized into actionable information. Good. One less complication. I closed Greg's report and handed it back to Sarah. Schedule a meeting with Diana for tomorrow. I want to discuss transitioning Greg to a new role when he returns, something that maintains organizational distance between us while recognizing his contributions in Tokyo. Already on it, Sarah confirmed. Diana has a proposal for creating a new engineering excellence department under Greg's leadership. Reporting structure would place him under the CTO, not directly in your chain of command. Efficient as always, Sarah had anticipated the necessary professional adjustments. The personal ones would be more complicated. Perfect. Now let's discuss the quarterly board presentation. The next 10 days passed in a blur of board meetings, client presentations, and strategic planning sessions. I buried myself in work, a familiar coping mechanism when facing emotional uncertainty. The corporate apartment remained my refuge, though I'd occasionally drive past our house, noting with a pang that Greg had arranged for landscapers to maintain the garden I'd always neglected. The night before Greg's scheduled return, I found myself in our home, my home, for the first time in months. The cleaning service had kept it immaculate, but it felt like a museum of our former life. Photos of happier times, furniture we'd selected together, the kitchen where he'd critiqued my domestic failings while I secretly ran a multi-million-dollar company. I ran my fingers along the marble kitchen island where this story had effectively begun, remembering his dismissive comments about my supposed laziness. How different things might have been if I'd simply told him the truth from the beginning. Or would they? Would the Greg I'd first married have celebrated my success, or felt diminished by it? My phone buzzed with a text from an international number I recognized as Greg's Tokyo line. Landed at SFO, heading to the Meridian Hotel downtown. Available to meet tomorrow if your schedule permits. So formal, so distant, like colleagues rather than spouses who'd shared a life for 5 years. I typed back. Welcome back. Available at 7 p.m. Prefer meeting at the house rather than office. His response came quickly. The house is fine. See you at 7. I spent the night in the guest bedroom, unwilling to sleep in our marital bed, but needing to reclaim this space as my own before our meeting. In the morning, I drove to the office feeling oddly calm. Whatever happened with Greg tonight, the weight of deception had been lifted. For better or worse, we would face each other as our authentic selves. The day passed with excruciating slowness. I reviewed his final Tokyo reports, approved Diana's proposal for his new role, and tried to focus on routine operational matters while the minutes ticked by. At 6, I left the office, stopping to purchase ingredients for a simple dinner. Not out of wifely obligation, but as a gesture of hospitality. Neutral ground for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. He arrived precisely at 7, punctual as always. The sound of his key in the lock, a key he still possessed despite our separation, sent an unexpected jolt through me. When he stepped into the entryway, I nearly dropped the glass of wine I'd been holding. 3 months in Tokyo had changed him. He'd lost weight, his face more angular than I remembered. His hair was styled differently, slightly longer and less rigidly controlled. But the most striking difference was in his posture. Gone was the reflexive authority, replaced by something more measured, more contained. Emma. He nodded, setting down his briefcase. You look well. As do you, I replied, suddenly conscious of the domestic tableau I'd created. Wine poured, dinner simmering on the stove. Tokyo agreed with you. In many ways, yes. He glanced toward the kitchen. You're cooking? A small smile touched my lips at his evident surprise. Contrary to popular belief, I do know how to prepare a meal. I just chose to prioritize other activities during our marriage, like running a technology empire, he observed, the comment free of the bitterness I might have expected 3 months ago. Something like that. I gestured toward the living room. Would you like some wine? Dinner. Will be another 20 minutes. He accepted the glass I offered, taking a seat on the sofa rather than his usual armchair. A small but noticeable deviation from our old patterns. "I've been following Horizon's stock performance," he said after taking a sip. "The market has responded positively to the integration. Congratulations." "Thank you. Your work in Tokyo contributed significantly to that success." I settled into the chair across from him, maintaining a deliberate distance. "Diana's proposal for your new department has been approved, by the way. Engineering excellence, reporting to Sheng in the CTO office." Greg nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "She mentioned the possibility before I left. It's a good fit, allows me to focus on technical leadership rather than client management, and creates appropriate organizational distance between us," I added, addressing the unspoken factor. "Yes." He met my gaze directly. "I assume that consideration was intentional." "It was," I confirmed. "Whatever happens between us personally, maintaining clear professional boundaries is essential." He set down his wine glass, leaning forward, slightly. "And what do you want to happen between us personally, Emma?" The directness of his question caught me off guard. The old Greg would have strategized, positioned, approached the conversation obliquely. This straightforward inquiry suggested he'd indeed changed during our time apart. "I'm not sure," I answered, honestly. "These past 3 months have given me perspective, but not certainty. What about you? What do you want?" He considered the question carefully before responding. Another departure from his previous pattern of quick, confident declarations. "I want to understand who we really are, individually and together. Whether the connection we felt was based on authentic selves or convenient fictions. Whether there's something worth rebuilding now that the masks are off." The thoughtfulness of his response touched something in me I hadn't expected to feel. Hope. Tentative but undeniable. "When did you first suspect?" I asked, a question that had nagged at me for months. "About my company, I mean. Was there ever a moment where you sensed something didn't add up?" Greg smiled slightly, swirling the wine in his glass. "There were dozens of moments. The mysterious phone calls you'd take in another room. The craft conventions that always seemed to align with major industry events. The way you sometimes slipped and used corporate jargon at dinner. Shock rendered me momentarily speechless." "You noticed all that?" "Of course I noticed. I just created explanations that fit my preconceptions." He shrugged, the gesture self-deprecating rather than dismissive. "Maybe you were having an affair. Maybe you were gambling online. Maybe you were taking business courses secretly. Any explanation seemed more plausible than my wife being a secret CEO." "Why didn't you ever ask?" "Pride. Fear." He looked down, at his hands. "Convenience." "Convenience?" I echoed, puzzled. "Our arrangement was comfortable for me," he admitted, the confession clearly difficult. "I got to be the successful provider, the knowledgeable advisor. Your apparent struggles made me feel needed, important. If I'd questioned too deeply, I might have disrupted that dynamic." His self-awareness was startling, so different from the man who'd belittled my supposed lack of ambition just 3 months ago. "Tokyo changed you," I observed. "Being 12,000 kilometers from everything familiar has a way of forcing reflection," he agreed. "But the catalyst was earlier. It was watching you in that boardroom, commanding the respect of everyone present, demonstrating a leadership, skill I'd never achieved despite years of trying." The timer in the kitchen chimed, saving me from having to formulate an immediate response to his unexpected candor. "That's dinner," I said, rising. "We should eat while it's hot." In the kitchen, I busied myself with plating the simple pasta dish I'd prepared, using the momentary separation to process what was happening. The Greg who had returned from Tokyo was not the Greg who had left. He seemed more thoughtful, more self-aware, less defensively certain of his superiority. Was it genuine growth or merely a strategic adaptation to changed circumstances? And why did I find myself hoping it was the former? We ate at the kitchen island rather than the formal dining room, another break from our established patterns. The conversation shifted to safer topics: Tokyo's architecture, the cultural challenges of the integration, mutual acquaintances at both companies. Diana's transformation of the HR department has been remarkable, Greg noted as we finished eating. The initiatives she's implemented in 3 months have changed the entire culture at Everglade. She should have been in leadership years ago, I replied. The fact that she wasn't speaks volumes about the barriers that existed. Barriers I was complicit in maintaining, he acknowledged, surprising me again with his candor. Even if not actively, then through passive acceptance. I studied his face, searching for signs of performance or calculation and finding none. You've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I've had little else to do in Tokyo besides work and reflect, he admitted. Reading helped too. Diana recommended some books on gender dynamics in corporate environments. Eye-opening doesn't begin to describe it. And these realizations, are they because you genuinely care about equality, or because your wife turned out to be your boss? The question was blunt, perhaps unfair, but necessary. Instead of taking offense, Greg considered it seriously. Initially, probably self-preservation and shock. But the more I read, the more I recognized patterns in my own behavior, not just with you, but with female colleagues throughout my career. Things I'd said and done without questioning, because that's how the men around me always behaved. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I can't claim some miraculous transformation into the perfect feminist ally after 3 months of reading. But I can say I'm committed to continuing the work of examining my own biases. The sincerity in his voice was compelling, but years of hiding my true self had made me cautious about accepting words at face value. Actions matter more than intentions, I said, rising to clear our plates. Agreed. He stood as well, gathering his own dish. Which is why I'd like to propose something concrete. I raised an eyebrow, waiting as he helped me load the dishwasher. Another small but significant departure from our old dynamics where kitchen cleanup had been solely my job. I'd like us to try dating, he said finally. Dating? I repeated, confused. We're already married. Legally, yes. But in reality? He closed the dishwasher, turning to face me directly. We've never known each other authentically, Emma. You kept your professional identity hidden. I performed the role of wise provider. We were playing characters. In a marriage, not building a genuine partnership. There was undeniable truth in his assessment. Our relationship had been built on mutual performance, my pretense of domestic inadequacy, his assumption of superior wisdom and capability. So you want to start over? I clarified. Not exactly. We can't erase our history or the legal reality of our marriage. But we can create space to discover who we truly are, without the masks and roles we've been playing. It was such a reasonable suggestion, methodical, measured, logical. Typically Greg in its practical approach, yet fundamentally different in its acknowledgement of mutual responsibility. How would this work? I asked, curiosity overtaking skepticism. We live separately and meet for occasional dinners like newly acquainted colleagues. Something like that, he agreed. Professional boundaries at work, personal exploration outside of it. No expectations, no assumptions about where it leads, just authentic presence with each other. The proposition was appealing in its simplicity. No dramatic reconciliation scene, no sweeping declarations of unchanged love, just two people creating space to know each other truthfully for perhaps the first time. And if we discover there's nothing left between us once the performances are stripped away, I had to ask. Then we'll have clarity, he answered simply. Better to know the truth than to cling to comfortable illusions, don't you think? His words echoed my own thinking these past months, the recognition that truth, however painful, was preferable to comfortable deception. I think, I said slowly, that I'd like to try. A genuine smile transformed his face. Not the confident smirk of, old but something warmer, more vulnerable. First date Friday night? I know a little Italian place downtown. Unless the CEO of Horizon Technologies is too busy for dinner with a mere department head? The teasing had a different quality than before, self-deprecating rather than condescending, inviting me to share the joke rather than making me its target. I think I can clear my schedule, I replied, returning his smile. Though I should warn you, I'm not the struggling housewife you once thought you knew. Thank goodness for that, he said, surprising me again. She was never the woman I found. Most interesting, anyway. As we moved to the living room with fresh glasses of wine, the conversation shifted to practical matters, where he would live while we navigated this new arrangement, how we would handle questions from colleagues and friends, the boundaries we needed to establish between our professional and personal interactions. I've found an apartment downtown, he said, answering my unasked question about living arrangements. Month-to-month lease, nothing permanent, seems appropriate given the circumstances. And your mother? What have you told her about our situation? Patricia Harmon had been notably silent these past months, unusual for a woman who had previously offered her opinion on every aspect of our marriage. Greg grimaced slightly. The truth, more or less, that you're a successful CEO who kept your career separate from our marriage for complex reasons. That we're working through what that means for our relationship. And how did the domestic goddess take the news that her daughter-in-law isn't actually a failure at womanhood? I couldn't keep the edge from my voice, remembering years of Patricia's thinly veiled criticism. With surprising grace, actually. Greg's response wasn't what I expected. She called me an idiot for not recognizing your capabilities sooner. Said any fool could see you were destined for more than keeping house. I nearly choked on my wine. Patricia said that? The woman who criticized my dusting technique and told me no man wants to come home to an untidy house? Greg's expression was rueful. Apparently, her traditional stance was less about limiting women and more about believing in doing everything to the highest standard, including a career, if that was your choice. She assumed you weren't working because that's what I'd told her. The revelation was disorienting. Had I misinterpreted Patricia's criticism all these years? Had my own preconceptions about her traditionalism created yet another layer of misunderstanding in our already complicated family dynamic? She'd like to have lunch with you, Greg added. Her idea, not mine, said she wants to know the real Emma, not the version I described. I'll consider it, I managed, still processing this unexpected development. As the evening progressed, we carefully navigated the strange territory between estranged spouses and tentative new acquaintances. There were moments of surprising connection, discovering shared perspectives on business ethics we'd never discussed during our marriage. There were also awkward silences and painful acknowledgments of how thoroughly we'd both participated in the fiction of our relationship. It's getting late, Greg observed eventually, glancing at his watch. I should go. Early meeting tomorrow with Sheng about the new department structure. I walked him to the door, a peculiar formality given that his key still hung from his keychain. At the threshold, he paused, turning back to me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Thank you for dinner, and for being willing to try, whatever this is. Thank you for suggesting it, I replied. It's more than I expected when you left for Tokyo. He nodded, a shadow crossing his features. I was angry then, hurt, convinced. You'd orchestrated everything to humiliate me. And now? Now I understand it was never about me at all. Your choices were about protecting yourself in a world that hasn't been kind to ambitious women. He met my gaze directly. I regret being part of that unkindness, even unwittingly. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within me, a place that had protected itself for so long behind walls of performance and pretense. Friday at 7, I confirmed, redirecting to safer territory. I'll pick you up here, he agreed. Not the office. We're dating outside of work, remember? After he left, I moved through the quiet house, turning off lights and locking up for the night. In the master bedroom, I hesitated before the closet we had once shared. His section remained. As he'd left it 3 months ago, suits precisely spaced, shoes in perfect alignment. My section, once carefully curated to project the image of a modestly unsuccessful housewife, now contained the power suits and designer pieces I'd always kept at my corporate apartment. The physical integration of our true selves, even in something as simple as a closet, felt significant. Not reconciliation, not yet, but an honest acknowledgement of who we really were and the possibility of connecting those authentic selves. The days leading up to Friday passed with an unexpected sense of anticipation. At work, we maintained professional distance. He focused on establishing his new department. I dealt with the broader corporate strategy and investor relations. When we encountered each other in meetings, our interactions were cordial, focused, on business matters without personal undertones. Sarah noticed, of course. Something's different, she observed, following me into my office after a product strategy session where Greg had presented his department's roadmap. The tension between you has changed. We're trying something new, I acknowledged, unwilling to elaborate further even to my closest confidant. Good, she said simply. Whatever it is, you both seem lighter. She was right. The weight of performance and pretense had been exhausting for both of us. Even this tentative exploration of authentic connection felt freeing by comparison. Friday evening arrived with a mix of nervousness and curiosity I hadn't experienced since our earliest dates, before the patterns of performance had solidified, when there had still been genuine discovery between us. Greg arrived precisely at 7, dressed in clothes I'd never seen, a casual elegance that suited him better than the rigid formality he'd favored during our marriage. "You look nice," he said as I opened the door, his appreciation seeming genuine rather than perfunctory. "Ready for our first date?" The Italian restaurant he'd chosen was intimate without being romantic, busy enough for privacy but quiet enough for conversation. As we settled into our corner table, I realized with a start that we'd never actually dated like this during our courtship. Our early relationship had been a whirlwind of charity galas and networking events where performance had taken precedence over genuine connection. "So, Emma Chen, CEO of Horizon Technologies," Greg began once we'd ordered, a playful formality in his tone. "Tell me about yourself. The real version, not the one you think I want to hear." And so I did. I told him about founding Horizon after leaving a toxic corporate environment where my ideas had been repeatedly stolen by male colleagues. About the early years of bootstrapping, working 18-hour days while simultaneously maintaining the fiction of struggling with simple household tasks. About the strategic decisions that had grown the company from a startup in my spare bedroom to an industry leader. He listened with genuine interest, asking insightful questions without the condescension that had characterized his previous attempts to help with my career. When our meals arrived, he shared his own story, not the polished narrative of continuous success he'd presented during our marriage, but the messier reality of failures, doubts, and hard-won lessons that had shaped his professional development. "I was terrified of disappointing my father," he admitted, explaining his driven perfectionism in ways he'd never articulated before. "He built his construction company from nothing, expected me to achieve even more. When I chose technology instead of taking over the family business, the pressure to prove him wrong about my choices was enormous." These vulnerabilities had always been there, I realized, buried beneath layers of projected confidence and carefully maintained control. Had I been so focused on hiding my own truth that I'd missed the complexity of his? "To success on our own terms," I proposed as we shared dessert, raising my wine glass in a toast. "And to honesty between us, Whatever comes next, he added, clinking his glass against mine. By evening's end, something had shifted between us. Not dramatic reconciliation, but a tentative bridge across the chasm of misunderstanding that had separated us for years. As he walked me to my door, insisting on the full date experience despite the fact that we were technically still married, neither of us quite knew how to conclude this strange new beginning. I enjoyed tonight, I said, keys in hand, feeling oddly shy after 5 years of marriage. Getting to know the real Greg Harmon. I enjoyed meeting the real Emma Chen, he replied, smile reaching his eyes. She's quite remarkable. The moment stretched between us, laden with history and possibility. Then, with deliberate care, he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to my cheek. Chaste, respectful, yet somehow more intimate than many of our marital interactions had been. Second date next week? He asked, stepping back. There's a gallery opening downtown. The artist uses technology in interesting ways. Might appeal to both our interests. I'd like that, I replied, surprised by how much I meant it. As I watched him walk to his car, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us here. From the deceptions and power imbalances of our marriage to this tentative exploration of authentic connection. The lazy housewife and the condescending husband were gone, replaced by two people seeing each other clearly, perhaps for the first time. I couldn't know what the future held for us, whether this new beginning would lead to genuine reconciliation or amicable separation. The damage of 5 years of mutual performance couldn't be undone in a single dinner, or even a series of carefully structured dates. But as I entered the house, my house, our house, whatever it might become, I felt something I hadn't expected. When this journey began 3 months ago, not certainty but possibility. Not the restoration of what was, but the potential for something new. Something built on truth rather than convenient fictions. My phone buzzed with a text from Greg. Thank you for tonight, for the second chance neither of us may deserve, but both might need. I smiled, typing back. To new beginnings, whatever form they take. Whether those new beginnings would ultimately lead us back to each other or toward separate futures remained to be seen. But after years of navigating both my career and my marriage through layers of deception and performance, the simple truth felt like its own kind of victory. The lazy housewife was gone forever. In her place stood a woman fully embodying her power, professionally and personally, ready to discover if authentic connection could grow in soil once poisoned by mutual pretense. Only time would tell. But for the first time in years, I was facing that future without masks or roles, simply as myself, with all the vulnerability and strength that entailed. And regardless of where this path led with Greg, that authenticity was a kind of freedom I'd denied myself for far too long. It was time to fully claim my narrative, all of it, and see what might grow in the light of truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us.